I gave him a choice: divide the assets equally among his daughters, or I would file for divorce and expose the lie about his legacy. There are moments that look perfect from the outside, like a painting you'd see in a museum. Tonight was one of those moments. From my seat at the long mahogany table, I saw my husband Richard at 68, Ethan to his right, and Amelia opposite. The chandelier threw a warm gold over the crystal and lamb. A perfect portrait, except for the hairline crack I could already feel. It was a feeling I'd grown accustomed to over 40 years of marriage. A subtle atmospheric pressure that dropped whenever Richard was about to make a proclamation. The air in our dining room, which always felt more like a boardroom, grew still and heavy. The cheerful clinking of silverware slowed. The conversation faded. It was Richard's birthday, but he was the one holding court, and he was the one about to bestow the gifts. "All right, settle down," he boomed, though we were already silent. He had a way of speaking that filled every corner of a room, leaving little space for anyone else. He raised his wine glass, his eyes still sharp and piercingly blue, fixed on our son. A man's legacy isn't just about the company he builds. It's about the man who carries it on. "Ethan, you've done me proud. You've got my head for business, but you're smarter, faster. You've earned this." My stomach tightened. I glanced at Amelia. She was tracing the rim of her water glass, her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had perfected since childhood. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, velvet-wrapped object. He slid it across the polished wood to Ethan. "My father gave this to me on my 30th birthday. His father gave it to him. A Thompson man has carried this for over a century." Ethan unwrapped it. A vintage gold watch lay nestled in the velvet, its face worn smooth with time. It was more than a watch, it was a coronation, a symbol. Ethan's face flushed with pride as he fastened it to his wrist. "Dad, I'm speechless." "Thank you." He held up his arm, admiring the way the gold caught the light. "It suits you, son," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Then, he turned his gaze, almost as an afterthought, to Amelia. "Amy, sweetheart, you look lovely tonight. Happy birthday, Dad," she said, her voice soft but clear. The smile she gave him was genuine, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It never did, not when she looked at him. I held my breath, praying he would have something for her. A token, a word of genuine praise for the incredible woman she had become. He saw a successful businessman in Ethan, but he seemed incapable of seeing the strength it took for Amelia to be a pediatric oncology nurse, to hold the hands of dying children and comfort their grieving parents day in and day out. Richard cleared his throat, taking back the floor. "Now, for the main event," he announced, a showman's glint in his eye. "Your mother and I met with the estate lawyers last week. Finalized everything. A man my age has to get his house in order." He looked at me, but his gaze was distant, as if he were looking through me at the wall behind. "Carol and I are comfortable, but the real wealth, the legacy, needs to be protected. It needs to grow." The air crackled. Ethan leaned forward, a hungry look on his face. Amelia picked up her fork and began pushing a stray green bean around her plate, her focus suddenly intense, as if the fate of the world rested on that single vegetable. "The company, Thompson Construction, will transfer entirely to Ethan." "Of course," Richard declared. "Effective upon my death or complete retirement. The house, this land, the entire investment portfolio, that will all go into a trust, also managed by Ethan, to ensure the Thompson name continues to stand for something in this town for another 100 years. The words didn't hit me like a bucket of ice water. They hit me like a physical blow, a fist to the gut that knocked the air from my lungs. I felt the blood drain from my face. I gripped the heavy linen napkin in my lap, twisting the fabric until my knuckles were white. The room began to swim, the scent of the lamb suddenly nauseating. He had just disinherited our daughter in front of us. He had erased her. My gaze snapped to Amelia. She had flinched a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, but her face was a mask of calm. She had set her fork down gently. She was looking at her plate, her dark hair falling forward to hide her expression. But I saw it. Just before she looked down, I saw the flicker of a pain so deep and so old. It broke my heart in two. She had expected it. That was the part that killed me. My daughter had spent her entire life expecting to be told she wasn't worth as much as her brother. Richard wasn't finished. He turned to Amelia, his voice softening with a kind of false, paternalistic generosity that was more cruel than his silence. And Amy, don't you worry. We've set up a separate trust for you. A nice little cushion. $100,000. Enough so you'll never have to worry about anything. $100,000. Against an estate worth well over $20 million. It wasn't a cushion, it was an insult. It was a tip left on the table for a daughter who had given her entire life to caring for others. Ethan, to his credit, seemed to sense the cruelty of the moment. He reached over and placed a hand on his sister's arm. That's great. Amy, Dad's taking care of everyone. His words were meant to be comforting, but they sounded like a dismissal. The real business is handled. Now, here's your little share. Amelia finally looked up. She glanced at Ethan's hand on her arm, and then at her father. She offered him a small, watery smile. Thank you, Dad. That's very generous. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and as she spoke, a single tear escaped and traced a silent path down her cheek, which she quickly, angrily, wiped away. Richard either didn't see it or chose not to. He beamed, satisfied. Good. It's settled then. He clapped his hands together. Now, who wants cake? Carol. Let's have the cake. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Ethan started talking about a new commercial real estate deal. Richard laughed, pouring them both more wine. It was as if a bomb had gone off, and only Amelia and I could hear the ringing in our ears. I stood up on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and walked to the kitchen. As the door swung shut behind me, the sound of their laughter felt like a violation. I stood there in the silent, sterile kitchen, my hands braced against the cold granite island. And for the first time in 40 years, I looked back at the closed door and saw not a family, but a kingdom. And its king had just named his heir and cast his daughter out into the cold. The forced cheerfulness of saying goodnight was the hardest part. I hugged Amelia, my arms lingering, trying to pour a lifetime of love and apology into that one embrace. She hugged me back tightly, a silent acknowledgement that she understood. I saw her get into her modest sedan, the taillights shrinking into the darkness, and it felt like I was watching a part of my own soul drive away. Ethan clapped his father on the back, the gold watch gleaming under the porch light, before climbing into his sleek, dark SUV. The doors closed, the engines faded, and then there was only the sound of crickets in the manicured bushes lining our driveway. The performance was over. Richard and I walked back inside without a word. The house, usually a testament to a life of success, suddenly felt cavernous and cold. The leftover plates and glasses on the dining table looked like artifacts from a forgotten feast. Richard went straight to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a brandy, the glug-glug of the liquid echoing in the silence. I followed him into the living room, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I waited until he had settled into his high-backed leather armchair, the one that always looked like a throne. I stood before him, feeling like a nervous subordinate about to question a CEO. Richard, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. We need to talk about what happened tonight. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, not bothering to look at me. What's to talk about? Carol, the plan is sound. The legacy is secure. He used that word again, legacy. It was a shield he held up to deflect any hint of human emotion. Legacy? I took a step closer, my hands clenched at my sides. What about family? What about your daughter? Did you not see her face tonight? You broke her heart in front of all of us. For the first time, he looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Amy has always been overly sensitive. She's a nurse. For God's sake. She sees real tragedy every day. She'll be fine. The condescension in his tone was a spark to dry kindling. This wasn't a tragedy she saw at a hospital. Richard. This was her own father. On his birthday. Telling her to her face that she is worth a fraction of her brother. That her life's work, her compassion, means nothing compared to Ethan's profit margins. He took a slow sip of his brandy, his gaze unwavering and cold. This has nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with logic. Ethan runs the company. He needs the capital, the assets, to ensure it grows. Giving him control is the only decision that makes financial sense. Amelia's trust fund is a gift, a generous one. It's more money than she'll ever know what to do with. I stared at him, a chasm opening between us with every word he spoke. It was the calm, rational way he explained his cruelty that was so staggering. He had weighed and measured his own children on a set of scales and found one wanting. I thought of all the years, all the parent-teacher conferences, school plays, and graduations. Had he always seen them this way, as an asset and a liability? She is not a line item on a balance sheet. Richard, she is our daughter. My voice cracked. The raw emotion I was trying to suppress, finally breaking through. She chose a path of service, of helping people. We should be proud of that, not punish her for it. I am not punishing her, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. He set his glass down on the coaster with a decisive click. I am rewarding the son who followed in my footsteps, who has worked for 2 decades to build what I started. What has Amelia built? She gets a paycheck from a hospital. There is no comparison. And it is naive of you to pretend there is. The room was silent again, but this time it was a ringing, deafening silence. I looked around at the expensive paintings on the walls, the curated objects on the shelves, the life we had built. It all felt like a movie set. Beautiful and completely fake. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the partner I thought I had. The man who held my hand when my own father died. The young man who once told me he wanted a big, happy family more than anything. That man was gone. Or perhaps he had never existed at all. In his place was a cold strategist. A king who saw his family as a dynasty and his children as pawns. I walked over to the fireplace, running my hand along the cool marble of the mantelpiece. On it sat a row of framed photos. Ethan in his graduation cap, shaking his father's hand. Richard and Ethan on a golf course, trophies in hand. And a small, slightly older photo of Amelia in her nursing school uniform, her face bright with optimism. Richard rarely looked at that one. He is our son, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But she is our daughter. They are supposed to be equal in our hearts. Are they not equal in yours? It was a direct question, a plea for him to show me a flicker of the man I thought I married. I was giving him a chance to walk it all back, to say he had made a mistake. He stood up and walked towards the grand staircase, already unbuttoning his cuffs. He was done with the conversation. Love has nothing to do with this, Carol. This is about preserving a lifetime of work. My decision is logical, and it is final. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into his home. You're being emotional. I suggest you sleep on it. You'll see the sense in it by morning. And then he turned and walked up the stairs, his footsteps confident and steady on the oak treads. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sounds of him preparing for bed, the squeak of his closet door, the running water in the bathroom, the soft thud of his shoes on the floor. Each small, domestic sound was a hammer blow to the foundation of our 40-year marriage. You're being emotional. He said it as if it were a disease, a malfunction of the mind. But in that moment, my emotions were the only thing that felt real. My anger was a clean, hot flame. My sorrow for Amelia was an ache so profound it felt like a part of my own body had been amputated. He was wrong. I wouldn't see the sense in it by morning. For the first time, I was seeing everything with a terrifying, absolute clarity. I saw the countless small cuts and dismissals Amelia had endured over the years. The casual praise lavished on Ethan for simply existing, the way Richard's attention always followed the money. I had been a peacekeeper, a buffer, smoothing things over, telling Amelia her father loved her in his own way. But my peacekeeping had been a form of complicity. My silence had been an endorsement. I finally moved, walking slowly up the stairs into the oppressive quiet of our bedroom. The room was immaculate, just as our housekeeper left it. Richard was already in bed, lying on his side, his back to me. The space beside him on the king-sized bed seemed miles wide. I looked at the back of his head on the pillow and felt nothing but a vast, cold distance. He thought the discussion was over. He believed he had won, as he always did. But as I stood there in the silent dark, the cool air from the vent washing over me, I realized this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He had built a wall, and I would have to find a way to tear it down. Sleep was an impossibility. I lay beside Richard in the dark, the space between us a frozen river, listening to the steady, untroubled rhythm of his breathing. How could he sleep? How could he shatter our family and then drift off as if he'd just balanced a checkbook? Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall below was a countdown. But to what? I didn't know. The anger from our confrontation had cooled, hardening into something heavier and colder. Resolve. Just before 5 o'clock, with the first hint of gray light straining against the windows, I slipped out of bed. I couldn't stand being in that room, in that house, a moment longer. I went downstairs to the sunroom, my sanctuary. It was the one room Richard had no interest in, filled with my overgrown plants, towering stacks of art books, and the faint, earthy smell of potting soil. It was my territory. I sank into a wicker chair, the cool pre-dawn air chilling my skin, and pulled my phone from my robe pocket. My fingers trembled as I scrolled to the one person I knew would understand. My sister, Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice already sharp and alert. "Carol, it's 5 in the morning. What's wrong?" The dam broke. The words came out in a torrent, a rushed, whispered confession of the birthday dinner, the gold watch, the pronouncement, Richard's cold logic, his dismissal of my pain, of Amelia's pain. I recounted the whole ugly scene, and as I spoke the words aloud into the quiet of the morning, they sounded even more grotesque. When I finally finished, the silence on the other end of the line was not one of shock. It was a heavy, weary silence. "Well," Sarah finally said, her voice devoid of any surprise. "I've been waiting for this call for 30 years. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "What? You knew? Knew?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Carol, I'm an accountant. I see patterns. I've seen the pattern in your family since the kids were in elementary school. Ethan got a savings bond for an A on his report card. Amelia got a pat on the head. Ethan got a car for his 16th birthday. Amelia got a bus pass. I saw it. Everyone saw it. The only one who refused to see it was you." Her bluntness stung, but it was the sting of antiseptic on a wound. It was true. A montage of memories flashed through my mind, me, justifying Richard's actions, telling myself he just didn't know how to connect with a daughter, that his way of showing love was providing. I had been his willing accomplice, the great peacemaker of the Thompson family. But peace at what cost? Why did I let it get this far? Sarah? The question was a genuine, desperate plea. Why did I never stand up to him? "Because you loved him," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Because his ambition built you a beautiful cage, and you convinced yourself it was a castle. You played the part of the professor's wife, the elegant hostess, the supportive spouse. It was easier to keep the peace than to start a war. But, Carol, he just declared war on your daughter. Are you going to keep playing the peacekeeper now? Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed last night now streamed down my face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a profound, shattering regret for my own silence. No, I whispered, wiping them away with the back of my hand. No, I'm not. Good. Sarah's voice turned brisk and practical again. Crying is done. Now it's time for work. You need to stop thinking like a wife and start thinking like an accountant. What do you actually know about your finances? I don't mean the credit card. I mean the real money. The investments. The property deeds. What's your name on? I felt a fresh wave of shame. I don't know. Richard always handled it. He said he had it covered, that I shouldn't worry my head about it. Of course, he did. She scoffed. Carol, you need to find the paperwork. The real files, not the quarterly statements he lets you see. He has an office, right? A filing cabinet? Yes, I said, my mind racing. Richard's office. The one room in the house even more off-limits than his side of the closet. It was his command center, a fortress of leather and mahogany. He's probably still asleep. You need to go in there and find the file for the estate. It'll be labeled estate planning or trusts. You need to get your hands on it. Photograph every single page with your phone. And you call me back the second you have it. The idea of sneaking into Richard's office sent a jolt of pure fear through me. It was a direct, tangible act of defiance. It was crossing a line that had been clearly drawn for 40 years. But Sarah was right. The time for tiptoeing around his ego was over. Okay, I said, my voice firm now. Okay, I'll do it. After we hung up, I sat for another minute, watching the sky slowly bleed from gray to a soft, hopeful pink. The rising sun felt like a permission slip. I stood up, walked out of my sunroom, and moved silently through the quiet house. The door to Richard's office was closed. I turned the cold, brass knob with an unsteady hand, wincing at the soft click of the latch. The room smelled of him leather, old paper, and a faint hint of sandalwood aftershave. It was meticulously organized. A massive desk stood in the center, its surface clear except for a computer and a neat stack of files. Against the far wall was a row of dark wood filing cabinets. My heart hammered in my chest. I felt like a burglar in my own home. For a moment, I almost turned back, the lifetime of obedience pulling at me like a physical chain. But then I pictured Amelia's face, that single, brave tear. My fear was nothing compared to her pain. I moved to the cabinets, my bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. The drawers were heavy, rolling open with a low, metallic groan. The files were labeled with Richard's precise, architectural handwriting. Taxes 2020. Contracts, Pine Ridge Development. Portfolio statements. And then I saw it. A thick, accordion file labeled simply, Thompson Family Trust and Estate. My hands shook as I lifted it out. It was heavy, weighted with the legal machinery that would shape our family's future. I carried it over to the desk and opened the clasp. Inside were dozens of documents, dense with legal jargon, signed by Richard, his lawyer, and my own signature. From years ago, on a document I barely remembered signing. I took out my phone and began, my hands growing steadier with each photo I took. Page after page, documenting the cold, calculated words that would enrich one child and dismiss the other. With every flash of the camera, I felt a layer of my old self sloughing away. The deferential wife, the quiet partner, the woman who didn't worry her head about these things. She was disappearing, and in her place, someone else was emerging. Someone holding a file that felt less like a legal document and more like a declaration of war. For 2 days, a fragile truce held. It was a silence stretched so thin it was transparent. You could see the anger and resentment shimmering right through it. Richard and I moved through the house like polite but distant ghosts. Our conversations limited to sterile pleasantries about the weather and the mail. He was watching me. I could feel it. He was waiting for me to see the sense in it, as he'd predicted. I spent my time in the sunroom, my phone and laptop open, cross-referencing the documents I'd photographed with Sarah's increasingly furious texts. For the first time, I was studying the architecture of our wealth, and I was discovering that the foundations were not what I thought they were. The ambush came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book about Florentine art, when Richard walked in. "Carol," he said, his voice measured and calm. Too calm. "Could you spare a moment? Ethan is here. We'd like to have a little family talk." I looked up. Ethan was standing just behind him in the doorway, his hands shoved in the pockets of his expensive slacks, a carefully neutral expression on his face. My heart sank. This wasn't a casual visit. It was a planned, coordinated maneuver. They had strategized. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach, but I met their gaze, closing my book and setting it deliberately on the side table. "Of course," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt. "Please, sit down." They took their usual positions, Richard in his leather throne of an armchair, and Ethan on the sofa opposite me. They looked like a corporate delegation, Thompson and Son, here to handle a personnel issue. The issue, I realized with a sickening lurch, was me. Richard began, leaning forward and steepling his fingers, the picture of paternal concern. "Your mother and I had a disagreement the other night, Ethan, and she's been, well, very distant since. I'm worried about her." The gaslighting was so immediate, so textbook. It was almost laughable. He was framing my justified anger as a mental health issue. He wasn't addressing his actions, he was questioning my reaction. Ethan picked up his cue seamlessly. "Mom," he said, his voice laced with a gentle, practiced sincerity. "Dad told me you were upset about the estate plan. I get it. It's a lot to take in. But I want you to know, I'm going to take care of Amy. I always will. This isn't about leaving her with nothing." I looked at my son, at his earnest face, and felt a wave of betrayal so profound it almost took my breath away. He was not here as my child, or as Amelia's brother. He was here as his father's soldier. "This isn't about you taking care of your sister, Ethan," I said, keeping my voice level. "This is about what is right. It's about a father treating his two children with equal love and equal respect. What your father announced the other night was not respectful. It was dismissive and cruel." Ethan's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. This was the part that hurt the most. He didn't see it. He truly did not see it. "Mom, I think you're looking at this the wrong way. This is a business decision. The company needs to be consolidated to stay competitive. If the assets are split up, it weakens our position. I can't make the strategic investments we need to if half the capital is tied up somewhere else. Dad's taught me that. This is to protect the family, to protect his life's work." His words, meant to sound logical and responsible, only revealed the depth of his indoctrination. The family he was protecting was a brand name. The life's work he was honoring had come at the cost of his own sister's dignity. "The Thompson family is not a corporation, Ethan," I said, my voice hardening. "And Amelia is not a non-performing asset to be liquidated for a pittance." Richard intervened, his calm facade beginning to crack. "That's enough. Carol, you're being hysterical, and you're twisting our words. Nobody is liquidating anyone. We are trying to have a rational conversation, and you are making it emotional." A girl's heart was broken at that table. "Richard, tell me, what part of that is not emotional?" I turned my gaze back to my son. "Did you talk to her, Ethan, after you left here the other night? Did you call your sister to see how she was?" He had the grace to look away, his eyes falling to the intricate pattern on the rug. I was going to. It was late. No, I said, the word hanging in the air like a judgment. You didn't, because you don't think anything is wrong. You're sitting there in a suit you bought with the company card, with your grandfather's watch on your wrist, telling me that your sister, who is probably at this very moment holding the hand of a terrified child with cancer, should be happy with the scraps from your table. A flash of anger crossed Ethan's face. He was not used to being challenged. Scraps? $100,000 is not scraps, and it's not my fault Amy chose a career that doesn't pay well. I chose to follow Dad, to learn the business, to work 60-hour weeks. I earned my position. It feels like you're trying to punish Dad by undermining the company. By hurting me? There it was. He saw himself as the victim. The profound, unshakable entitlement of the golden child. So accustomed to the sun that the mere concept of shadow felt like a personal attack. The two of them, my husband and my son, were a united front. Their logic, a closed loop of self-interest and patriarchal tradition. They genuinely believed they were right, and that my dissent was a form of madness. Richard stood up, looming over me, his patience clearly gone. He was moving from manipulation to intimidation. This has gone on long enough. Carol, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this ends now. You are upsetting the entire family with this nonsense. You will drop this. The decision is made, and it is final. For the good of the family. Ethan stood up too, a loyal lieutenant backing his commander. Mom, please, he said, his voice pleading now. Don't do this. Don't break our family apart over this. The emotional blackmail was their final, desperate play. They were holding the idea of family hostage, a family they had just finished defining as a business enterprise. I looked at their two faces, so similar in their handsome, determined set, and the last vestiges of fear and doubt in my heart vanished, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard certainty. I rose slowly from my chair, so that I was standing level with them. I met my husband's furious gaze, then my son's worried one. The family you're so worried about me breaking apart, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of my newfound conviction, is already broken. You broke it on Tuesday night, when you decided a daughter was worth less than a son. I held their gaze for a moment longer, letting the truth of that statement settle into the suffocating silence of the room. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving them standing there amidst the ruins of their failed ambush. Walking away from my husband and son was like stepping off a cliff. For a moment, there was a terrifying freefall, the shock of my own audacity, the severing of a 40-year-old bond of obedience. But I did not crash. I landed on something I hadn't realized was there, a bedrock of my own resolve. Their ambush had failed, and in its failure, it had given me the one thing they wanted to strip away: absolute certainty. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I made an appointment for myself, with a lawyer Sarah had recommended, without telling my husband. The act of driving downtown, of finding a parking spot in a busy garage, of walking into a sleek, modern office building, it all felt clandestine and profoundly liberating. The lawyer's office was nothing like the stuffy, wood-paneled rooms I imagined from Richard's world. This was a space of glass and light. The woman who greeted me, Ms. Anya Sharma, had a firm handshake and eyes that were both sharp and kind. She wasn't old, perhaps in her late 40s, and she projected an aura of calm, formidable competence. For the first time in days, I felt like I could finally breathe. Mrs. Day. Thompson, she said, gesturing for me to sit in a comfortable chair opposite her minimalist desk. Your sister gave me a brief overview, but I'd like to hear everything from you. And so, I told her. I recounted the story that was now seared into my memory, my voice even and measured, no longer choked with the fresh pain of the moment. I told her about the birthday dinner, the watch, Richard's speech, Amelia's tear, the confrontation in our living room, the gaslighting. I laid it all out on the polished surface of her desk like a collection of broken pieces. Ms. Len. Sharma listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. When I was finished, she simply nodded. Thank you for sharing that, Carol. I want to be very clear. What you're describing is a classic, albeit high stakes, case of financial and emotional abuse. The attempt to frame your valid emotional response as hysteria or instability is a common tactic intended to make you doubt your own reality. You are not the problem here. Hearing a professional, an objective outsider, validate my experience was like a cool drink of water after days in the desert. The tension I had been holding in my shoulders for nearly a week began to ease. My sister said I needed to show you these, I said, taking out my phone. I had emailed the photos of the documents to her office, but I brought them up on my screen now. I went into my husband's office. This is the main trust agreement. She leaned forward, studying the screen. She zoomed in, her brow furrowed in concentration. Yes, it's exactly as you described. Irrevocable. Ethan is the sole trustee and primary beneficiary of the asset trust. Amelia is granted a specific fixed sum. Your own provisions are adequate, but you have no control. It's ironclad. Richard has locked you both out completely. My heart sank a little. So, there's nothing I can do? I didn't say that, she replied, looking up at me. An agreement like this, signed by both spouses, is difficult to challenge, but not impossible. We can argue undue influence or lack of full financial disclosure at the time of signing. It's a hard fight. She paused. Did you photograph anything else from his files? I hesitated. Yes. I wasn't sure what was important. I saw a folder with my father's name on it. It was old. I photographed that too. I swiped through the images to an older, yellowed set of documents. Ms. Sharma's eyes narrowed. That's your father's will? Yes. He passed away 32 years ago. And what is this? She asked, pointing to a line item. A bequest to my beloved daughter, Carol Thompson, in the amount of $250. 000. That was my inheritance, I explained. It was a lot of money back then. I wanted to use it to open a small art gallery. But Richard, he said it was too risky. He told me he would invest it for us, that it was safer to let him manage it within his business. He said he'd make it grow for our future. Ms. Brakshan. Sharma was silent, her eyes scanning another document from that same file. It was a business proposal for a real estate venture called Eagle Ridge Properties. It was one of Richard's first major successes, the one that had catapulted his company from a local builder into a regional powerhouse. Her finger rested on a line in the capital investment summary. Carol, she said, her voice suddenly charged with a new intensity. What was the date of this proposal? I believe it was early 1993, right after my father passed. And what does this line say? Initial capital injection. Shareholder loan, $250. 000. She looked from the business proposal on the screen back to the will, and then up at me. The professional calm in her eyes had been replaced by a flash of something else, predatory excitement. Carol, she said, leaning across the desk. That wasn't his money to manage. That was your money. He didn't just invest it for you, he injected it directly into his company as foundational capital. Do you understand what that means? I stared at her, my mind struggling to connect the dots through a haze of 30-year-old memories of trust and deference. He paid me back. I think there were deposits into our joint account. It doesn't matter. She cut in, her voice sharp and clear. This paper trail establishes that your separate, inherited property was commingled and used as the seed money for what is now, I assume, a significant portion of your marital estate. It was never just his business. You were an initial, and arguably the most crucial, investor in his biggest success. An investor he has conveniently forgotten to mention. The world tilted on its axis. The story I had told myself about my life, that of the supportive wife to a brilliant, self-made man, was a fiction. I hadn't just been a silent partner cheering from the sidelines. I had been the one who handed him the fuel for his rocket ship, a fact he had systematically erased from our shared history. My compliance wasn't just me being a good wife. It was the cornerstone of his empire. The last of my grief and sadness evaporated, burned away by a white-hot, clarifying rage. This wasn't just about his cruelty to Amelia. It was about a lifetime of deception directed at me. The shock gave way to a surge of power so potent it made me dizzy. I was no longer a supplicant, begging for fairness for my daughter. I was a claimant, armed with a truth that could bring his entire carefully constructed legacy crashing to the ground. I looked at Ms. Sharma, whose expression was now one of focused, strategic anticipation. She saw what I was just beginning to see. The game had changed. The board had been flipped. He has no idea you know this. Does he? She asked. No, I said. The word, tasting of iron and strength. He has no idea. I leaned back in my chair, the fear and uncertainty I had walked in with completely gone. I was no longer a victim appealing for mercy. I was a queen who had just discovered the key to her own kingdom. I met my lawyer's gaze, my mind clear and cold as ice. So, I said, what do we do next? I drove home from Ms. Sharma's office in a state I hadn't felt in years, a dizzying, exhilarating clarity. The world seemed sharper, the colors of the autumn leaves more vibrant, the sky a more brilliant blue. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't a petitioner. I was a founder, a silent partner whose contribution had been deliberately erased. The anger was still there, but it was no longer a wild, chaotic fire. It was a focused, white-hot flame. I had leverage. I had a weapon. And for the first time, I felt like I could win. I walked into the house through the garage, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Richard's car was gone. A small mercy. I went straight to my sunroom, my command center, and sat down with a legal pad, my mind racing with strategies and questions for Ms. Sharma. For an hour, I was consumed by this new, powerful purpose. The phone buzzing on the glass table beside me barely registered at first. When I finally looked, I saw Amelia's name on the screen. A wave of love and guilt washed over me. In the heat of my own battle, I hadn't stopped to think about how she was navigating the fallout. I answered immediately, a cheerful, reassuring tone ready on my lips. Amy, sweetheart, I was just thinking of you. Mom? Her voice was small and tight, strained with a sadness that cut right through my newfound armor. Mom, Ethan called me. Of course, he had. He would have called her right after the ambush, twisting the narrative to paint me as the villain, the homewrecker. He told me, he said you're talking to lawyers, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. He said you want to challenge the will, that you're threatening to tear everything apart. Mom, please tell me it's not true. My heart ached. The beautiful, simple clarity I had felt just moments before fractured into 1,000 complex pieces. It's complicated, honey. No, it's not, she pleaded, and I could hear the tears she was fighting back. Please, Mom, stop. Whatever this is, just... I can't bear it. I can't bear thinking of you and Dad at war. Sweetheart, your father has left me no choice. What he did to you? Me? She interrupted, her voice rising with a sorrowful passion. This isn't about me. Mom, I don't want the money. I never did. Can't you see that? It's not worth this. It is not worth destroying what little we have left of a family. I would rather have peace and not a single penny of his money than have this. Her words were a gut punch. Here was my daughter, the one I was fighting for, begging me to lay down my arms. She was willing to accept the insult, to swallow the injustice, all for the sake of a fragile peace. A peace that I now knew was a lie. I made my peace with Dad a long time ago. Mom, she went on, her voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a heartbreakingly mature resignation. I know he doesn't see me. He doesn't value what I do, and he never will. And that's okay. It hurts, but it's okay. I don't need his approval or his money to know who I am. My life is good. I have work that I love. I have people who depend on me. I have my own worth. Please, don't do this for me. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers against my eyelids. Pride and shame warred within me. Pride in this incredible, resilient woman my daughter had become. A woman who had forged her own sense of value in the shadow of her father's indifference. And a deep, profound shame that I had let her do it alone for so long. That she'd had to build such strong walls to protect her own heart inside her own family. She thought I was fighting for money. And maybe, in the first flush of anger, that had been part of it. But standing in Ms. Sharma's office, seeing the decades-long deception laid bare, it had become something else entirely. Amelia's plea, her beautiful, selfless, heartbreaking plea, crystallized it for me. Amelia, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Listen to me. I hear you. And I have never been prouder of you than I am in this moment. You are right. Your worth has absolutely nothing to do with him. You built it yourself. And it is untouchable. I paused, taking a deep breath. But you've misunderstood me. This stopped being about the money the moment your father looked you in the eye and saw a balance sheet instead of his daughter. This is about the truth. What truth? She asked, confused. That he loves Ethan more? I already know that. No, I said firmly. The truth that a daughter is equal to a son. The truth that a life of service is as valuable as a life of profit. The truth that a wife is an equal partner, not a silent subordinate. These are the truths I failed to uphold in our family for 30 years. I kept the peace, just like you're asking me to do now. And my silence let him believe that his version of the world was the only one that mattered. My silence hurt you. I will not be silent anymore. I could hear her quiet sobs on the other end of the line. Honey, I am not fighting for your inheritance, I continued, the purpose in my heart clearer than it had ever been. I am fighting for your honor. If I stand down now, if I accept his terms, I am telling him that he was right. I would be confirming that you are worth less. I would be validating his belief that my own contributions were meaningless. And I will not let that stand. I would rather burn the whole thing down than let that lie become our family's final legacy. The line was quiet for a long moment, filled only by the sound of her soft breathing. She didn't agree. Not fully. I could feel her conflict, her deep-seated desire for harmony warring with the truth of my words. Just be careful. Mom, she finally whispered. Please, just be careful. I will. I promised. We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call. The sunroom was silent again. The elation I had felt an hour ago was gone, replaced by a heavier, more somber determination. The battle ahead was now lonelier than I could have imagined. Even the person I was fighting for had asked me to surrender. But her plea had not weakened my resolve, it had purified it. This was no longer about avenging a hurt. It was about correcting a fundamental wrong. A wrong I had allowed to fester for far too long. The fight was no longer just for Amelia. It was for me. For the woman I should have been all along. The day of the meeting, I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for a final, decisive battle. I didn't choose a power suit or anything that felt like a costume. I wore a simple, elegant silk blouse and trousers in a soft gray. It was the clothing of the woman I had always been, but I wore it with a new posture, a spine made of steel. Mrs. Nade. Sharma's conference room was a study in calculated neutrality. A long, polished mahogany table, 12 high-backed leather chairs, a sleek screen on one wall, and a large window offering a panoramic, indifferent view of the city below. A crystal carafe of water and a collection of glasses sat untouched in the center of the table. A still life for a conflict yet to begin. We were there first, seated on the side of the table facing the door, prepared and calm. Richard and Ethan arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a man who looked like he'd been pulled from one of Richard's 1,980 seconds corporate photos. He was older, with a florid face, a suit that was a little too tight, and an overly confident smile. This was Arthur Davies, Richard's lawyer for 30 years, a man from an era where wives were patted on the head and business was done on the golf course. They sat opposite us. The air in the room instantly became thick and heavy, charged with unspoken hostility. Richard's face was a stony mask of fury. Ethan looked pale and nervous, his eyes darting between his father and me. Avoiding my gaze, "Mr. Davies began, his voice a folksy, patronizing boom. "Well, now," he started, placing a thick briefcase on the table. "I'm glad we could all come together. I'm confident we can clear up this little family misunderstanding without any more unnecessary drama." Ms. Nod. Sharma didn't even blink. "Thank you for coming, Arthur," she said, her voice cool and precise. "But let's be clear. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a formal mediation to discuss the fraudulent misrepresentation and distribution of marital assets. My client is here to present her terms." The smile on Davies' face faltered. Richard's jaw tightened. "Now, Anya, that's some mighty strong language," Davies blustered. "Richard has been more than generous. We are not here to debate generosity." "Ms. Sharma cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. She slid 3 neatly bound sets of documents across the polished table. "We are here to discuss facts." Richard stared at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. Ethan tentatively reached for a set. On page 1. "Ms. Persend," Sharma continued, her voice narrating the execution, "you will see a copy of the last will and testament of Carol's father, Henry Martin, dated 1992. Please turn to page 3, section 4. You'll note the bequest of $250,000 to his daughter." I watched Richard's face. Not a muscle moved, but I saw a flicker deep in his eyes, a tiny flare of panic that he extinguished almost immediately. Ethan was frowning, reading the page with a look of complete confusion. "Now, please turn to the next document in your packet." "Ms. Not of Fane," Sharma instructed. "This is the 1993 business prospectus for a new venture, Eagle Ridge Properties. You'll note the founder is listed as Richard Thompson, and if you turn to the capital summary on page 5, you will see a line item for an initial shareholder capital injection. Arthur, would you mind reading the amount aloud for us?" Davies's face had lost its ruddy confidence. It was now a blotchy, uncomfortable red. He stared at the paper, his mouth slightly agape. "The amount, Arthur." "Ms. Sharma prompted gently. "It says $250,000, he mumbled. "Indeed," she said. "The exact amount of my client's inheritance, injected into your client's company less than 3 months after she received it." She leaned forward. "For 30 years, Mr. Thompson has operated under the fiction that he is a self-made man who built his company from the ground up. The truth, however, is that his most critical and successful venture was founded upon the separate, inherited property of his wife, a wife who has now been written out of the legacy she helped build." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan looked at his father, his expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror. This was not a history he had ever been taught. The myth of his father, the great builder, was crumbling before his eyes. Richard finally spoke, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "This is outrageous. That was a loan. It was paid back into our joint accounts over the years. A loan requires a contract. Richard, documentation, interest, none of which exists." "Ms. No," Sharma countered smoothly. "What this documentation proves is the commingling of separate assets for business purposes, giving my client a clear, traceable, and significant equity stake in the origins of the Thompson fortune. An equity stake that is not reflected in the estate plan you recently tried to execute." Now, it was my turn. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of 40 years of silence, of peacekeeping, of deference, and I felt it all fall away. I looked directly at my husband. "You didn't just use my money, Richard," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the table like a ringing bell. "You used my trust. You used my belief in you. And then you stood in our home and told me my contributions were merely emotional. You didn't just try to disinherit our daughter. You tried to erase me from our own story. You tried to erase the truth." I let that sink in before I delivered the final blow. "So, this is what is going to happen," I said, my gaze unwavering. "There are no negotiations. These are the terms. First, the current estate plan is to be considered null and void, effective immediately. Second, you will create a new, single, irrevocable family trust. All marital assets, the company, the properties, the portfolio, everything will be placed within it. Third, upon our deaths, the contents of that trust will be divided into two, and only two, perfectly equal shares. One for Ethan, one for Amelia." I paused, letting them absorb the totality of my demand. Richard looked like he was going to explode. Davies was sputtering, trying to form an objection. "And if you refuse," I finished, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper, "then this meeting is over. At 9 a.m. tomorrow, Ms. Sharma will file a petition for divorce on my behalf. The petition will include a motion for an immediate forensic audit of Thompson Construction and a claim for 40% of all assets, based on the fraudulent use of my initial investment. And the story of how our family legacy was really built will become a matter of public record for the entire world to see." The threat hung in the air, a guillotine poised over the one thing Richard held dearer than money: his reputation, his legacy. The room was utterly silent. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Richard's eyes burned into mine, filled with a furious, impotent rage. He was trapped. He looked at Ethan, searching for his loyal soldier. But Ethan was staring down at the documents. The color drained from his face. His ally was gone. The ambush had been reversed. Finally, Richard broke eye contact, turning his stony gaze to his own lawyer. The silence stretched for an eternity. He had built an empire on the principle of absolute control, and in one afternoon, he had lost it completely. He gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He couldn't bring himself to say the words. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He looked at Ms. Sharma, his bravado gone, replaced by the weary look of a defeated man. "Draw it up," he said. "We agree to the terms." I stood up, my movements fluid and light. Ms. Sharma rose with me. I didn't offer a handshake. I didn't say thank you. I simply looked one last time at the man I had spent my life with. Now, a stranger across a battlefield, and then I turned and walked out of the room. The silent click of the closing door, the only sound of my victory. The months that followed the mediation were not filled with celebration. There was no champagne, no triumphant calls to friends. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness in our big house. The signing of the new trust documents was a sterile, silent affair in Ms. Sharma's office. Richard's signature was tight and angry. Mine was fluid and free. We returned to our home. Two signatories to a treaty. No longer partners in a marriage. We continued to live under the same roof. But the river of silence that had flowed between us had widened into an ocean. The war was over. But the battlefield was our life, and there were casualties. But spring eventually came, and with it, a different kind of beginning. I stood in the newly opened wing of the St. Jude Children's Hospital, a place so full of light and color it felt like a rebellion against the very idea of sickness. Murals of cheerful animals covered the walls, and sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating the hopeful, bustling space. The air didn't smell of antiseptic, but of fresh paint and possibility. It was the dedication ceremony. I watched from a small distance as Amelia, looking radiant in her simple blue dress, stood beside the hospital administrator, cutting a large red ribbon with a pair of oversized scissors. A smattering of applause filled the hallway. To one side, a simple bronze plaque was affixed to the wall. It read, "The Thompson Family Pediatric Wing, funded by a foundational gift from the Amelia Thompson Trust." My eyes welled with tears. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was it. This was the result. Not the lines of code in a bank account or the cold clauses in a legal document. It was this. A place of healing. A legacy of compassion. Richard was here. I saw him near the back of the small crowd, standing alone. He looked older, smaller somehow, adrift in a world he didn't build and didn't quite understand. Our eyes met for a moment across the room. There was no anger left in his gaze, only a hollow sort of resignation. He gave me a short, stiff nod before turning to look out the window. We were no longer at war, but we would never be at peace. Ethan was here, too, standing awkwardly near the entrance, a few feet from his father. He and I had spoken a few times over the past months, stilted, cautious conversations about the weather, about the business. The old, easy entitlement was gone from his voice, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He caught my eye and walked over, his hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said, his gaze fixed on the plaque. "It's amazing." He looked around at the nurses, moving purposefully through the halls, at a little girl with no hair being pulled in a red wagon by her father. I never really saw it before. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a confusion and a regret that felt genuine. What Amy does. I never saw it. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a beginning. It was a crack in the foundation of the world his father had built for him. "She's an incredible woman," I said softly. He nodded, unable to speak. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope for my son. After the ceremony was over and the small crowd had dispersed, Amelia came and found me. She slipped her arm through mine, and we stood together in the quiet hallway, looking at the plaque. "You didn't have to do this, Mom," she whispered, her head resting on my shoulder. I smiled, reaching up to squeeze her hand. "This isn't a gift, sweetheart," I told her, my voice full of a peace that felt as solid and real as the wall in front of us. "It's a correction. It's the truth, made of brick and mortar." We stood there for a long time, watching a nurse gently coax a smile from a small, tired-looking boy. I thought about the word Richard had used so often, the word he had sacrificed his family for, legacy. He thought a legacy was something you owned, something you built of steel and stone and passed down like a crown. But he was wrong. I looked at my daughter, a woman whose life was a testament to quiet strength and profound empathy. And I looked at this place of healing that would stand for generations. A true legacy isn't what you control. It's what you create, what you nurture, what you give back. My marriage was a ghost of what it had been. My relationship with my son was a fragile work in progress. But the woman I had become, the mother I had finally learned to be, was whole. I had lost the comfortable peace of a life built on convenient fictions. but I had won something far more valuable in its place: the beautiful, difficult, undeniable truth. And in that truth, I was finally free. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and fighting for justice in your own family? I would be honored to read your story in the comments. Wishing you peace and clarity on your journey.